The weight of the pack straps cutting into my shoulders was the only thing that felt real, the only thing reminding me I wasn't just some ghost drifting through this damned country. 2 weeks ago, I was a replacement, fresh off the train with a clean uniform and a head full of drillfield nonsense, handed a rifle and marched east with a batch of other green kids to fill the holes punched in the battalion. The veterans, the ones who'd been in it since the push into France, they looked at us not with welcome, but with a kind of weary calculation. They were tallying how long we'd last, and their eyes, those old-man eyes in young men's faces, told me the odds weren't good. My unit, what was left of it, was a collection of grim, silent figures who moved with an economy of motion I could fathom. They didn't waste a step, didn't waste a word. When we stopped for 5 minutes on the roadside, they'd slumped down, backs against a shattered wall, and their eyes never stopped moving, scanning the tree lines, the sky, the rubble, seeing threats in shadows I just thought were shadows. Me, I was all clumsy noise, my boots seeming to find every twig, my canteen clanking against my belt buckle. I felt like a liability, a loud, scared boy trying to blend in with men who had become part of the landscape of war itself. The cold seeped up from the frozen ground through the soles of my boots, a damp, persistent chill that made your bones ache, and the taste in your mouth was always the samey mix of stale black bread, the metallic tang of fear, and the ever-present dust from shattered bricks and pulverized roads. We'd been walking for what felt like days, through a world reduced to shades of grey and black, the silence broken only by the crunch of our boots, the occasional distant crump of artillery, and the labored breathing of the man in front of you. You learned to listen to that breathing. A change in its rhythm could tell you more about what was happening than any officer's command. Then, just as the first weak light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, turning the mist that clung to the frozen fields into a swirling soup, the whole column just stopped. No shouted orders, just a silent ripple passed back from the front, a raised fist from the sergeant, and everyone froze in place, melting into the ditches and behind what little cover there was. The sudden stillness was louder than the marching had been. My heart started hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. This was it, I thought. Contact. I fumbled with my rifle, my gloves suddenly clumsy, my mouth going dry. I peered into the mist, trying to see what the point men had seen. All I could make out was a low, dark shape squatting in the middle of the road about 100 meters ahead. It wasn't a tank, thank God. Too small, wrong silhouette. But it was something mechanical. I glanced at the veteran next to me, a guy named Steiner who had a scar running from his ear to his chin. He wasn't aiming his rifle. He was just staring, his head cocked to the side like a curious dog. His expression wasn't one of alarm, but something else. Confusion, maybe. Disbelief. That scared me more than if he'd started shooting. If Steiner was confused, then what in God's name were we looking at? Then the whispers started, passed back down the line from man to man, a soft, sibilant rustle like dry leaves skittering across stone. The word reached me, carried on a breath of cold air. Jeep. Jeep, what the hell was a jeep? I'd never heard the word. We had Kubelwagens, stout little things, practical, but this was different. The whispers continued, little bursts of stunned commentary. It has no roof, one guy muttered, his voice full of incredulity. It's just open, like a child's toy. Another, his voice low. How is it so small? How can it be an army vehicle? It looks like it's made of tin. There was no scorn in their voices, not really. It was a kind of grudging, bewildered admiration. Steiner finally spoke, not to me, just to the air. 4 men and a machine gun. That's all you need. Simple. No frills. He said it with a respect I'd never heard him use for any of our own equipment, not even the Tigers. We were then ordered forward cautiously, weapons ready, and as we closed the distance, the thing emerged from the mist fully. It was just sitting there, abandoned, angled into the ditch like its driver had been in a hell of a hurry to leave. It was tiny, impossibly so. It looked like it had been stripped down to its absolute essentials, just an engine, 4 wheels and seats. No doors. A flat, ugly little thing, painted in a dull olive green. It was so utilitarian, so brutally functional. One of the guys nudged it with his boot, and it rocked on its springs. Lighter than a motorcycle and sidecar, he grumbled. I ran my gloved hand over the fender. It was thin, flimsifying compared to the solid steel of our vehicles. But that was the point, wasn't it? This wasn't built to be impressive or imposing. It was built to be everywhere, to do anything. It was the absolute opposite of everything we'd been taught about machinery, about industry. We built marvels of engineering, complex, over-engineered masterpieces that broke down if you looked at them wrong. This Jeep was a tool. A simple, effective, brutally efficient tool. And that's when the real coldness set in, a chill that had nothing to do with the morning mist. It started as a small, hard knot in my stomach, a seed of doubt that began to sprout thorns. The unspoken question hung in the air around all of us veterans. You could feel it. What kind of an army builds such a thing? Not an army of farmers and shopkeepers, like the propaganda leaflets told us. This was the product of a different kind of mind. A practical mind. An industrial power that didn't waste time on grandeur, that focused purely on output, on function. We had underestimated them. I had underestimated them. Up until that moment, the enemy had been a faceless thing, a concept, the Americans, a distant industrial giant we were told was soft, unprepared. But seeing this little Jeep left behind in the mud made it all terrifyingly real. This was the artifact of a nation that could churn out simplicity and strength by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. If they could make something like this, what else could they make? The fear I felt then was deeper than the fear of a bullet or a shell. It was the fear of inevitability. The march after we left the Jeep behind was different. The silence was heavier, more thoughtful. We weren't just tired men walking to the front. We were men walking toward the machine that built that Jeep. And I knew, right then, that my war had changed. It was no longer about ideology or flags. It was about survival against a force whose sheer, pragmatic genius was sitting right there in the road, rusting, a monument to how wrong we all were. You never forget your first glimpse of the other side's handiwork, not when it tells you something you really, really don't want to know. That little Jeep was more frightening than any king tiger because it wasn't just a weapon. It was a message, and we were all just learning how to read it. You get numb to it after a while, you really do. That's the thing they never tell you, the thing the newsreels back home can't possibly show. It's not the big battles that wear you down, not entirely. It's the constant, grinding weight of it all, the smell of wet wool and dirt and cordite that gets into your clothes, your skin, your lungs, until you forget what it was like to breathe air that didn't taste of smoke and decay. By 44, for me and the other old hands, the guys who'd been at it since Poland or France, the war had become a kind of terrible job. You woke up cold, you ate whatever slop you could scrounge, you moved when they told you to move, and you tried not to get killed. The excitement, the patriotism that bleeds out of you in some field hospital miles back, left in a stain on a surgeon's table. What's left is a kind of animal cunning, a deep, tired focus on just one thing, survival. So when the whisper started moving down the line, passed from foxhole to foxhole like a bad rumor, my first thought wasn't curiosity. It was a cold, practical calculation. What now? What new devilry have they dreamed up for us this time? The word was Jeep. Stupid word, a child's word. It sounded like something from a comic strip. We'd heard things, of course. Intelligence reports, chatter from prisoners, but it was all abstract. Then one afternoon, during a lull in the shelling near St. Lo, I saw it. Not up close, mind you, but through my field glasses, bouncing along a muddy track a few hundred meters away, through the shattered skeleton of an orchard. And my first feeling, I'm ashamed to say, wasn't fear or awe. It was a bitter, cynical dismissal. It was so small, like a toy. After years of facing down Soviet T-34s and hulking British Matildas, after seeing the terrifying silhouette of a Panzer, this little thing looked almost laughable. But that's the trap, isn't it? The small ones are always the most dangerous. A landmine is small. A piece of shrapnel no bigger than your thumbnail can end you. My mind immediately started working, the old survival calculus kicking in. No armor to speak of, just thin sheet metal. A rifle round would go straight through it. The crew exposed to the waist, brave or foolish, I couldn't decide which. I remember whispering to Klaus, my bunkmate, a kid from Hamburg who still had some light in his eyes. "Look at that," I hissed, my cheek pressed against the cold, damp earth of the parapet. A tin can on wheels, one good burst from the MG-34 and its scrap. But Klaus didn't answer. He was just staring, and in that silence I started to really see it, and the cold dread began to seep into my gut. You have to understand, we were used to machines that were substantial. Our trucks, our half-tracks, even our motorcycles with side custody were heavy, solid, engineering marvels maybe, but they drank fuel like a drunkard drinks wine, and they were prone to breaking down if you looked at them wrong. This American Jeep, it was different. It moved with a kind of jaunty, insulting agility. It didn't care about the mud that bogged down our Opel Blitz trucks to the axles. It just skittered over it, its skinny tires digging in and finding purchase where our vehicles would have sunk without a trace. It was fast, too. Not in a straight line on a paved road, but in this torn-up landscape, it was like a gadfly, impossible to swat. And that's when the professional soldier in me, the part that hadn't been completely worn away by fatigue, felt a grudging, hateful respect. This wasn't a weapon for a set-piece battle. This was a weapon for chaos. It was for reconnaissance, for darting behind lines, for ferrying officers around at speeds that made our ponderous movements look medieval. It was for hitting supply depots and artillery emplacements, and then vanishing before we could even get a gun tube turned in its direction. Threat wasn't the Jeep itself. It was what it could do. It could multiply the enemy's eyes and ears. It could make every inch of ground behind our lines feel insecure. But the real kick in the teeth, the thing that truly chilled me, was what it represented. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a statement. A statement made in steel and rubber, loud and clear for anyone with the eyes to see. I looked at that Jeep, at its clean lines and its obvious, robust simplicity, and I saw everything we were losing. I saw factories somewhere in America, working 3 shifts a day, untouched by our bombers. I saw endless convoys of ships crossing an ocean we couldn't even threaten, bringing not just jeeps, but tanks, planes, fuel, food, cigarettes, chocolate, everything. We were rationed to the bone. Our trucks ran on synthetic fuel that clogged the engines when they had fuel at all. We were patching uniforms, reusing shell casings, stretching everything to the breaking point. And here was this Jeep, this little buggy, and it just screamed of a bottomless well of resources. That's when I heard the younger boys, the replacements who'd only been at the front a few weeks, whispering with a kind of nervous excitement. "Look how it moves," one of them said, his voice full of a wonder that I hadn't felt in years. And that's when I had to do the cruelest thing a soldier can do to another. I had to crush that hope. I turned my head, my face grim. I could smell the damp earth on my uniform, see the stubble on Klaus's young face. "It's not about the Jeep, you idiot," I whispered, my voice low and harsh, not much more than a breath. "Don't you see? It means their factories are safe. It means they have fuel we can only dream of. They can make 10,000 of these things for everyone we manage to destroy." I saw the light in his eyes flicker and die. It was like snuffing out a candle. "This isn't a battle anymore," I added, the weight of the words feeling like a physical stone in my chest. "It's a war of attrition, and we are being attrited." That was the moment the last shred of illusion fell away. The war was lost. It wasn't a question of if, but of when, and how many of us would be left to see the end. The Jeep was just the messenger, a tiny, bouncing harbinger of the inevitable collapse. And for a split second, staring at that thing bouncing across the French countryside, my mind did a terrible, wonderful thing. It fled. It left the mud and the fear and the crushing weight of command, and it went home. It was 1938. I was driving my father's old Horch, the one with the leather seats that smelled of oil and sunshine. I was on a country road outside Munich, the windows down, the wind in my hair, and next to me was Elsa, her head thrown back, laughing, her hand on my knee. We weren't going anywhere important, just driving for the sheer joy of it, the feeling of freedom, of speed without purpose other than pleasure. The memory was so vivid I could almost taste the fresh air, feel the warmth of the sun on my arm. Then a shell screamed overhead, landing a few 100 meters away with a ground-shaking crump, and I was back. Back to the mud, the cold, the smell of death, and the sight of that damned Jeep, now disappearing behind a hedge. The contrast was so brutal it was like a physical blow. That nimble little vehicle was everything our war machine was not. Efficient, abundant, and designed for a world that still had a future. Our machines, like our cause, had become lumbering, fuel-starved beasts, struggling just to move, let alone win. From that day on, the Jeep became a common sight, a constant, nagging reminder. We'd see them darting around, sometimes even captured ones pressed into our own service, until they broke down for lack of the right parts. We developed a dark humor about them. We'd call them the Yanks puppy. or joke that you needed a degree from some American technical school just to understand how something so simple could work so well. But the jokes were hollow. Every time I saw one, it was like a little needle pricking the bubble of denial we were all trying to live in. It was a symbol of a system that was richer, stronger, and simply better organized than ours. The fight went on, of course. We fought like cornered animals because we had no other choice. The Russians were coming from the east, and the stories from that front were enough to make even the most cynical among us determined to hold the line in the west. But the heart had gone out of it. The war became a grim exercise in endurance. How long can we hold this village? How long can we keep this road open? How many days can we survive on moldy bread and ersatz coffee? I think about that first Jeep a lot now, all these years later. More than the tanks, more than the planes, that little vehicle told me everything I needed to know about how the war would end. It wasn't about bravery anymore. We had bravery in spades. It was about rubber tires and full gas tanks and assembly lines that stretched for miles. It was about a world that could still afford to build a machine for joy, and then, when it had to, adapt it for war without losing its essential spirit. Ours was a world that had forgotten joy altogether, that could only build for destruction. When I finally surrendered to the Americans in '45, I saw them up close, those jeeps. They were everywhere, like ants. The GIs treated them with a casual familiarity that was both enviable and heartbreaking. They'd bang them around, drive them through hell, and they'd just keep going. I often wonder what happened to that first one I saw, the one bouncing through the orchard. Probably it was scrapped decades ago. But for me, it will always be there, a ghost from a past life, the little thing that showed me the writing on the wall, the whisper of a future we never got to have. The smell, that's what stays with you long after the sounds fade. It's a thick soup of things that don't belong to the shop, almost clean bite of antiseptic trying its damnedest to fight the heavy, coppery stench of blood. And underneath it all, the sour odor of mud and sweat and fear that clings to every uniform that comes through the tent flap. You think you get used to it, but you don't. You just learn to breathe through your mouth, which only lets you taste it, a metallic film on your tongue that never really goes away. My world was that tent, a canvas hell lit by blinding electric lights, where the day and night blurred into one long, exhausting stretch of stitching boys back together, or more often than not, just trying to make their end a little less horrible. You hear things in there, between the moans and the occasional screams that still jolt you awake sometimes. You hear the things men whisper when the morphine takes hold, or when they think they're alone in the dark. And after a while, the whispers weren't about the big stuff, not about panzers or Stukas, but about something small. A ghost, almost. They talk about this American vehicle, not a tank, but a little thing, fast as hell, they said. It would appear out of nowhere, kick up a cloud of dust, and be gone before you could even shoulder your rifle. At first, it was just a rumor, another piece of barrackroom gossip mixed in with the pain. We'd hear the wounded boys with their bellies torn open or legs shattered, their faces pale as parchment, and they'd murmur about this jeep. That's what they called it. I thought it was the fever talking, some new delirium. Was it a new kind of weapon, some sort of infernal machine? It sounded too fantastical to be real, a toy in a war of giants. But the stories kept coming from different sectors, different units, all describing the same thing, small, agile, and everywhere. Then I saw one. It wasn't in some glorious charge, nothing like that. The fighting had moved on, leaving behind that eerie quiet that's somehow louder than the battle itself. The air was still thick with the smell of cordite and burnt earth. We were moving the aid station forward, picking our way through a captured French village that was more rubble than buildings. And there it was, just sitting in the square near a cratered fountain, this little green thing. It looked so exposed. No armor to speak of, just a windscreen and a canvas top. An American officer was standing next to it, a colonel, I think, judging by the eagle on his hat. He had one foot up on the little running board, leaning over to look at a map spread out on the hood, and he was laughing with a couple of his sergeants. That's what struck me, the informality of it all. The laughter. In our army, a colonel was a guard, distant and unapproachable. You'd never see a German officer laughing with his enlisted men like that, not in the field, not ever. It was a small thing, but it felt huge. It spoke of an army that was different, not just in its machines, but in its soul. And my mind, it's trained a certain way, you see. I don't see a vehicle, I see a function. And my first immediate professional thought was one of a strange, aching jealousy. My God, I thought, I could get two, maybe three wounded men on those flat seats. I could get them off the field in minutes, not the hours it took us, bumping along in a horse-drawn wagon over shell-torn roads while the life seeped out of them. That little Jeep, it represented a chance, a real fighting chance for the boys who got hit. It was a miracle of efficiency. And that's when the whisper started in my own head, not about the Jeep itself, but about what it meant. It was a quiet, treacherous thought that you'd never say out loud, but one that every medic, every soldier who'd seen too much, must have had. This army, this American army that could produce something so perfectly suited for its job, an army that seemed to solve problems with practicality instead of just brute force. Maybe they were the kind of army that could end this thing. Maybe they could win, and win quickly. You have to understand the conflict that creates inside you. Your duty is to your country, to your comrades, to fight on until victory. But your heart, your real heart, the part that's still a human being and not just a soldier, looks at the endless stream of broken young men and thinks, please, just let it end. Let it be over, no matter how. Just stop the bleeding. You feel a traitor to the cause for even thinking it, but you also know you'd be a traitor to humanity if you didn't. That little Jeep became a symbol of that hope, a tiny, four-wheeled promise that this nightmare might have a finish line we could actually see. But hope is a dangerous thing in a war, because it's always got a darker cousin. The other side of that thought was a cold dread. An army this efficient, this well-supplied, wouldn't just win. It would fight. It would bring a storm of steel and fire the likes of which we hadn't seen. That efficiency wouldn't mean less bloodshed. It would mean the bloodshed could be delivered faster, more precisely, on a scale we couldn't imagine. The Jeep wasn't just a promise of an end. It was a promise of a hellish, intense journey to get there. And that was the burden I carried back to my tent, back to the smell of blood and antiseptic. Every time I heard the distant rumble of engines after that, my stomach would clench. Because I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this Jeep and the thousands like it that were surely coming meant more battles, more offensives, more young men, no older than my little brother, being carried into my tent and laid on my table. I could already see their faces, the ones who hadn't even been hit yet. It's a terrible knowledge to see the future in terms of casualties. You start to look at the fresh-faced replacements coming in, boys still bright-eyed and talking big, and you don't see soldiers. You see future patients, or worse. You have to fight to keep the compassion alive inside you, because it's so much easier to just become a machine, to see a wound and not a person. You have to force yourself to look into their eyes, to ask them about home, to hold their hand when the pain gets too bad. I remember one kid, couldn't have been more than 18, from Hamburg. He had a piece of shrapnel in his lung, and every breath was a wet, ragged gasp. He knew he was dying. He kept whispering about his mother's apple strudel, how the cinnamon smelled in her kitchen. I held his hand and told him to think about that, to just picture being there. It was all I could do. And as I sat there in the gloom after he was gone, the only prayer I could muster, a silent, desperate thought sent out into the universe, was that this Jeep, and the industrial might it represented, would be a swift knife, not a slow, grinding saw. Please, let it make this war shorter. Don't let it just mean the dying happens more efficiently. That's the thought that haunted me, the whisper that was louder than any shell. Is this the thing that saves us, or just the thing that kills us faster? You never really know, you see. You just keep working, keep wiping the blood off your hands, and hope that the world on the other side of all this is still a place worth saving. You never forget the smell of a place like that. It's not just one thing, it's a stew of smells that gets right down in your lungs and stays there. Damp earth from the shell craters, the sharp, bitter cordite from the explosions, and underneath it all, something sweet and rotten. That's the one you try not to think about. We were hunkered down in what was left of a French village. Name doesn't matter now, they all blurred together after a while. Just a few piles of brick and splintered wood that used to be somebody's home. The cobblestones in the square were all torn up, and the church steeple was leaning over like a tired old man. Me and my buddy Klaus, we were sharing a cigarette behind a broken wall, the smoke helping to cut through that god-awful stink. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We were tired, scared, and a long way from home. Home for me was a farm in Bavaria, rolling green hills and the clean smell of hay and manure, honest smells. I'd close my eyes sometimes and try to picture it, the way the light came through the barn slats in the afternoon, the sound of the cows lowing. I judge everything here by how it would work back there. That truck over there, too big, would get stuck in the mud by the creek. That motorcycle, no good for hauling anything. It was a game I played to keep my mind from going to darker places. I was always fiddling with things, even as a kid. My dad said I had grease in my veins instead of blood. I'd rather be taking apart a seasored-up tractor engine than almost anything else. That curiosity didn't just vanish when I put on the uniform. If anything, it got worse, because now my life depended on machinery that other men had built. You learn real quick to listen to an engine, to know what a healthy transmission sounds like, because the wrong noise could mean you're walking, and walking could mean you're dead. That's when we heard it. A different engine sound, not the deep-throated growl of our Opel Blitz trucks or the high-pitched whine of the Kettenkrad. This was a lighter, angrier sound, like a hornet that had swallowed a motor. It came bouncing around the corner of a ruined house, and for a second I didn't know what I was looking at. It was so small and bare. It was just a green shape, all angles and no grace, with a folded-down windshield and these big, knobby tires. It slid to a stop maybe 100 meters away, and two American soldiers jumped out, looking as casual as if they'd parked outside a grocery store. One of them lit a cigarette while the other unstrapped a radio from the back. They were talking, laughing even. I could hear the faint sound of it. We were all frozen, just watching. This was the enemy, right there in the open. But the officer next to me, Lieutenant Weber, a real Prussian stickler, just hissed, "Quiet, don't fire, observe." So we did. We observed this ridiculous little car that had no business being in the middle of a war. And that's when the whispering started, not from fear of the Americans, but about the machine itself. The guy next to me, Hans, who'd been a mechanic in Frankfurt, muttered under his breath, "Mein Gott, Vierantrieb, four-wheel drive." He said it like a prayer. I looked again and I saw it. The simplicity of it. No unnecessary sheet metal, no chrome, just a flat hood, a straight grille, and those axles sitting high up, giving it clearance you wouldn't believe. It was sitting in a patch of mud that would have sunk one of our heavy Kubelugens up to its axles, but this thing just sat there solid. The engine was still running, and it didn't sound labored or complex. It was just a straightforward, honest chugging. I could practically see the whole thing in my mind's eye. It was a mechanic's dream. Everything was right there, accessible. You could fix this thing with a wrench, some baling wire, and a strong word. It was built for work. Not for parades, not for impressing generals, but for work. For getting from point A to point B through hell itself. And in that moment, I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt in a long time, pure, unadulterated professional envy. I looked at our vehicles, hulking in the shadows, and I felt a kind of shame. We were so proud of our engineering, our big, powerful machines. But this was brilliance of a different sort. You see, our stuff was built for the war we wanted to fight. A grand war, a war of blitzkrieg and sweeping panzer divisions across open plains. The machines were magnificent when they worked. The Tiger tank, a monster of steel and firepower, was a terror. But it was so heavy, so complicated. It guzzled fuel we never had enough of, and if it threw a track or blew a transmission, which it often did, you needed a recovery vehicle and a small team of engineers to even think about fixing it. It was a beast built for a knockout punch. But this war, the war we were actually in, had become a slog. A muddy, bloody, house-to-house, hedgerow-by-hedgerow crawl. And in that kind of war, that little American Jeep was worth its weight in gold. It could go anywhere. It was fast, agile. It could carry men or ammunition or tow a light gun. It could be a scout car, an ambulance, a mobile command post. It was adaptable. And right then, I understood with a cold clarity that went deeper than any fear of enemy soldiers that we were losing not just because of numbers, but because of ideas. Their idea was simple, cheap, and effective. Ours was complex, expensive, and fragile. That little Jeep was a symbol of a nation that could build 1,000,000 of something and make it work. We built 1,000 masterpieces and watched them break down for lack of a spare part. I thought about all the times we'd had to abandon a perfectly good truck because we couldn't get a fuel pump or a simple gasket. I thought of the hours spent by the side of a road, me and the other fellows who knew a thing or two about engines, trying to MacGyver a fix with whatever we had, while the officers fumed and the columns stalled. That Jeep looked like it wouldn't have those problems. It was a tool, and a damned perfect one. The Americans finished their business, jumped back in that Jeep like it was nothing special, and with a spray of mud from those deep-treaded tires, they were gone. The sound of the engine faded away, but the silence they left behind was heavier than before. We all just looked at each other. No one said what we were all thinking. You couldn't. To admit that the enemy had built something better, something smarter, was a kind of treason. But it was there, in all our eyes. The lieutenant just scowled and said, "Back to your positions." It was just a scout car. But he'd seen it too. The way he looked at it, it wasn't with contempt, but with a kind of grim calculation. That was the unspoken truth that settled over us like a fine dust. Our war machine, for all its pomp and ceremony, was built for a different time. We were still fighting the last war, the one of glory and spectacle. They were fighting the war that was actually happening. And that practicality, that sheer, unromantic usefulness, was more dangerous than any number of tanks. A tank you could fear, you could respect, you could try to kill. But how do you kill an idea? How do you stop a philosophy that says, just get the job done? I thought about my father's farm. I thought about how that Jeep would have been a godsend. I could see myself driving it across the lower field, checking on the sheep, hauling feed, getting to town and back without worrying about the rain-swollen roads. It was a crazy thought, a traitorous thought, but it was there. The sadness of it hit me then, a different kind of sadness than the one you feel for a dead friend. This was a sadness for the waste of it all. Here was this piece of brilliant, simple design, and it was being used to ferry men to their deaths, to carry shells that would tear other men apart. The same mind that could create something so perfectly suited to its task was also the mind that created the bombs that turned this village into rubble. There was no separating it. The innocence wasn't just about being a farm boy seeing the horrors of war. It was about seeing the perversion of something good. The erosion of my national pride wasn't from a big battle loss, but from that single, quiet moment of looking at a Jeep. My pride was in German engineering, in German efficiency. And that little boxy vehicle, in its utter, unadorned efficiency, showed me that we weren't the masters of it we thought we were. Americans, with their chewing gum and their loud confidence, they had out-engineered us in the one thing that mattered most right then, survival. That night in the cellar we were using as a dugout, the conversation eventually turned to what we'd seen. It was dark, the only light coming from a couple of feeble candles. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of wet wool and unwashed men. We spoke in low voices, the way men do when they're talking about things that scare them. Klaus said, "Did you see the way it just went like a goat on a mountainside?" Someone else, I think it was young Erich, who was just a kid, said, "It looked fun to drive." And we all kind of laughed, a dry, hollow laugh. Fun, what a word to use here. Hans, the mechanic, shook his head. The engine, it's so simple, probably a side valve, nothing fancy. But that's the point, isn't it? Less to go wrong. We all knew what he meant. We spent more time nursing our own vehicles than driving them. The joke went that for every 10 kilometers a German panzer division advanced, it needed 100 kilometers of spare parts trailing behind it. It wasn't funny anymore. We started talking about the things we missed from home, really talking. Not just the big things, but the small, intimate details. The taste of a specific kind of bread from your local bakery, the feel of your own bed, the sound of a particular door creaking in your house. I told them about the old Fordson tractor we had on the farm. It was a cantankerous old thing, always breaking down, but I knew every bolt, every rattle. I could fix it with my eyes closed. I missed the feel of grease on my hands, the satisfaction of solving a mechanical puzzle. And I realized, sitting in that damp cellar, that the war had taken that away from me too. It had turned my curiosity, my love for how things worked, into a survival skill. I wasn't fixing things to make them work. I was fixing them so I wouldn't have to walk, so I wouldn't be a sitting duck. It had poisoned something pure. Seeing that Jeep brought all that back. It was a reminder of a world where machines served man, not the other way around. The next few days, I saw more of them. Once you notice something, you see it everywhere. Jeeps zipping down farm lanes, bouncing across fields, loaded down with more gear than you'd think possible. Each time that same feeling would come back. The admiration, the envy, the cold fear. It got so I could recognize the sound of their engine from a long way off. It was a sound of mobility, of flexibility, a sound we didn't have. We were bogged down, literally and figuratively. Our war was heavy, slow, deliberate. Theirs was light, fast, and improvisational. That Jeep was the perfect symbol of it. It was the difference between a symphony orchestra and a jazz band. We had the sheet music, the grand composition, but they were making it up as they went along, and somehow it was working. I think that was the moment I truly knew, deep in my gut, that we were going to lose. It wasn't when the bombers blackened the sky, or when we faced down a Sherman tank. It was seeing that first Jeep. It was the whispered admiration of a simple machine that revealed a fundamental weakness in our whole effort. We had bet everything on being stronger, on having the better, more advanced technology. But they had the better idea. They had built for the world as it was, not for the world as they wished it to be. And in a war, the world as it is the only one that matters. That's a hard thing for a young man to admit, especially one who was taught to believe in the invincibility of his nation. It chips away at you. The pride you're supposed to feel gets replaced by a grim, weary respect for the enemy, and that's a more dangerous emotion because it's based in truth. It steals your fighting spirit and replaces it with a desperate desire to just see the end, one way or another. You start thinking less about victory and more about survival, about going home, about maybe, just maybe, one day driving a machine like that on a peaceful road, under a quiet sun, for no reason at all except to feel the wind in your face and to go somewhere you actually want to be. You don't lead men by letting them see the questions in your eyes. That's the first thing you learn, or you don't last long. The weight of it, it's heavier than any pack, any machine gun you'll ever hump. It's a cold stone you carry right behind your ribs, and every decision you make, every time you point a finger and say, "Go there," that stone gets a little heavier because you know in your gut, that finger might be signing a boy's death warrant. A boy who trusted you. A boy whose mother's face you can picture if you let yourself. So you stop picturing faces. You look at your maps, you study the ground, the cover, the angles of fire, you listen to the artillery patterns until they're a song you hate but know by heart. You become a machine for assessing threats and opportunities, because if you stop, if you for 1 second think about Carl's laugh or little France who writes to his girl every night, then the stone gets too heavy to carry and you'll freeze. And freezing gets men killed faster than a bad decision. So you project calm. Even when the world is coming apart in fire and noise, you make your voice flat, your hands steady. You pretend you've seen it all before, even when you haven't. Especially when you haven't. That morning, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and crushed pine from the shelling the night before. It was that quiet, uneasy hour after Stanto, where the mist still clung to the firs like gauze, and the only sound was the drip-drip from the leaves of our camouflaged netting. My mouth tasted like old coffee and fear, that coppery tang you never quite get used to. I was checking the line, my boots sinking into the mud of the trench, a quiet word here and there with the sentries. Mula was rubbing a lucky charm his sister sent him, a little wooden bear. Becker was already cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that morning, a nervous habit. They were good boys. Tired, stretched thin, but good. My job was to keep them alive long enough to get tired and stretched thin somewhere else. Then, from the far end of the line, a sharp intake of breath. Not a shout of alarm, but a sound of pure, unadulterated confusion. I caught young Weber's eye and he just pointed, his mouth slightly open, down into the shallow valley below our position. At first I saw nothing, just the mist shifting. Then I heard it. Not the guttural growl of one of our kettencrads or the heavy chugging of a truck. This was a different sound, lighter, faster, a kind of buzzing snarl. And then it emerged from the tree line, bouncing over the ruts in a farmer's field like it was on a spring. It was small, green, and absurd. It looked like a toy a rich child might have, a bathtub toy with wheels. There were 2 men in it, sitting out in the open, no roof, no real doors to speak of. One was driving, the other had a rifle propped up. My first thought wasn't even tactical, it was just sheer disbelief. They're going to war in that. But then the machine in me, the sergeant machine, kicked in. My hand went up flat, the signal for absolute silence. It wasn't a gesture of fear. We needed to listen. The whispers started immediately, little ripples of anxiety running down the trench. What is it? Teufelswagen, devil's wagon. I silenced them with a sharp cut of my hand through the air. Eyes on it, I whispered, my voice low and firm, forcing a calm I didn't feel. Watch how it moves. Don't look at the men, look at the machine. And we watched. God, we watched. It took a ditch I'd have sworn would bog down a motorcycle without even slowing down. It spun around in its own length, a tight, vicious little turn that made my heart sink. I was already doing the math in my head, the terrible, cold calculus of command, speed, agility. It could carry what? 4 men, 5 if they squeezed. But it wasn't about the number it could carry. It was about what they could carry. Radio sets, mortar tubes, ammunition cases. This thing could go places our heavy trucks couldn't. It could slip through the woods, use goat trails. The tactical dread was a physical chill creeping up my spine. I imagined a dozen of these things, silent until they were right on top of you, disgorging squads of infantry at a weak point in the line before we could even call for support. I imagined them cutting our communication wires, hunting our artillery observers, turning our rear areas into a chaotic playground. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was a new rule book, and I was still reading the old one. I had to say something to the men. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for the sergeant to make sense of this nonsense. I crawled down the line, the cold mud soaking into the knees of my trousers. I stopped by each man, looking him in the eye, keeping my voice a low, measured whisper. "See," I said to Becker, whose knuckles were white on his cleaning rod. "It's fast, I'll give them that. But look, no armor, thin metal. It's a canvas box on wheels. You see one? You don't aim for the men bouncing around inside. They're a difficult target. You aim for the engine block. You put a round through that, and it's just a fancy coffin." I was turning their fear into a problem, a solvable mechanical problem. Aim here, not there. It's what soldiers do. We reduce the unimaginable horror of war into a series of small, manageable tasks. Clean your rifle. Dig your hole deeper. Aim for the engine block. It's a lie, of course, a beautiful, necessary lie. Because the truth was, that little Jeep represented something far more frightening than a single target. It was a symbol of an entire industrial machine we couldn't hope to match. But I couldn't say that. So I told them the lie, and I told it to myself, too. Just another target, boys. Nothing to be afraid of. And for a moment, I saw the tension leave Becker's shoulders. He nodded, a grim, determined look replacing the confusion. The lie had worked. But inside, the stone was heavier than ever. As the Jeep buzzed off into the mist and the field fell silent again, the full weight of it settled on me. The rules had changed, right there in front of my eyes. This war, which already felt like we were trying to hold back the ocean with our hands, had just found a new way to drown us. It wasn't the big, fearsome tanks that scared me the most. You heard those coming for miles. You could prepare. It was the agility, the sheer mobility of that little thing. My greatest fear as a commander was being outflanked, being cut off, failing my men because I was too slow, too rigid, too blind to see the new threat. And that Jeep was a threat to everything I knew. How do you defend against an enemy that can move that quickly? How do you plan when they can rewrite the map between dawn and noon? I looked at my squad, these kids I was responsible for, their faces now calm because Sergeant had given them a simple solution, and I felt a profound, chilling certainty that I was leading them into a storm we weren't built to weather. The personal fear was acid in my throat, the fear of failure, the fear of seeing that trust in their eyes extinguished because I couldn't adapt fast enough. And in that silent moment, staring at the empty field, I had to acknowledge the truth I would never whisper to my men. We weren't just fighting soldiers anymore. We were fighting factories. We were fighting an idea, a notion of war that was faster, lighter, and more ruthless than we could ever be. That little Jeep was just the messenger, and the message was that we were already lost. We just hadn't finished falling yet. The war became a different thing for me in that moment. It was no longer a series of battles to be won or lost on a map. It became a tide, and we were just rocks on the beach, waiting to be worn down. You learn to carry that too. You learn to carry the silence that comes after the calculation, the hollow space where your certainty used to be. You carry it, and you keep pointing your finger, and you keep telling the lies, because that's what it means to hold the line, even when you know, in your heart, the line is already gone.